It's pizza day. I love pizza. And today we're going to go through my process for making pizza, what I do, the recipes I use, and all of that. There are loads of different ways to do this, and everybody has their own way, their own preferences, and you'll find some very strong opinions online and elsewhere for how to make pizza. But this is how I make it. This is how I like to do it, and it works out well for me. So let's get right down to it. We start off with the chemistry, or with the dough, and I'm going to talk about how my dough comes together and what we do here. All right. So when I make my dough, I use basically Jim LaHaye's no knead bread recipe for this, a slight variation of it. And so lots of people use this recipe to make their bread. I use this recipe to make bread. Um, when I do this, I measure everything out by mass. I find that works better for me. So I get about 500 grams of flour, uh, 303 grams of water, and I mix with a little bit of salt and yeast and let it sit overnight. And so measuring by mass is really simple. I get what I want and all of that. So get all the dry ingredients put together, and then we get them all mixed up. All right, blend them until they're even. We want all that yeast and salt all mixed through. And then we're going to add our water. All right, and so when I add my water to this, again, so I'm measuring water by mass. One thing that I want to note is I'm going to use a KitchenAid blender for this. But when I used to do this before I had the KitchenAid, I just mixed by hand. I stirred by hand in a wooden spoon. The KitchenAid, I use it because I have it, and it makes life a little bit easier. But blending by spoon is just as good too. And so really, I mix this all up until there are no dry spots left in my dough. All right. So after that is all over, and I've got my water incorporated into my flour and salt and yeast. I scrape off the paddle and collect all my dough, and then just cover it with some plastic wrap. So pretty simple, right? And so I prep this the night before. That's the important part. I'm going to prep this the night before, and I'm going to let it sit out overnight, really until about 3 hours until I'm going to make my pizza. So I let it sit for a good 15 to 18 hours. All right. And so after I let it sit all night, the dough looks like this. Here's a picture of the dough on the right-hand side, and there are a couple of things that are going on here. All right. One of the first things that happens is you start to develop some gluten. In my class, I talked about gluten formation and bread baking before spring break, but just a little bit of a recap, right? So our flour has starches that are surrounded by proteins, and when we add water, those proteins come loose from the starches and start to connect with one another. And they're really shaggy at first, right? And so they stick to everything. But after we align that gluten, it becomes less sticky. And so if you leave this dough overnight, some of that gluten will form, and you don't have to do as much kneading as you would otherwise. The other thing that is really important in this reaction that's going on is we start to generate flavors. This long rise time is really good for generating really flavorful dough. Um, Typically, when you add yeast to flour, it starts chewing up all the sugars that are there and making carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is what causes our bread to rise. And that's really important here. All right. But when you do a slow rise, um, you start to allow other things to happen here as well. And some of those things involve the yeast and bacteria that are naturally around digesting the sugars and turning them into other flavor molecules. And the yeast and bacteria will also digest some of the proteins and turn those into flavor molecules as well. That is going to make for a really, really tasty dough and a really tasty crust as you go along. All right, so one of the important things with this recipe is to not use as much yeast in the initial amount as you normally would, right? So you cut down on the amount of yeast to slow that process down, to slow down the process of making carbon dioxide, and to allow enough time for some of this flavor generation to happen as well. One of the things that I do want to warn about is that when you let this long rise time happen, you are chopping up the proteins. You are going to chop up some of those gluten proteins, digest some of those gluten proteins. So your bread might not hold as tightly as it would otherwise, right? If you just made your bread rise more quickly. But it still turns out really nice, and I really love this bread recipe. I use it all the time. About 3 hours before I cook my pizzas, I'm going to partition all that dough into the individual pizzas that I'm going to use. So here I'm scraping out the dough from my big bowl after it's risen overnight. And I do this about 3 hours before I'm going to bake my pizzas, because I want my individual doughs to rise a little bit afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to spread it out into what I need. This amount of dough is going to make about 6 pizzas. So I get my portion, and then I start to form it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my hand underneath and sort of wrap the top of the pizza dough around my bottom fingers and get it all nice and tight. You can feel it tightening up as you do this. Coat it with a little bit of flour afterwards and stick it into a bowl and let it rise. All right, so we're going to move from our dough to our sauce. Here's my sauce recipe on the side. I use a recipe from America's Test Kitchen. It calls for some whole peeled tomatoes. I use about 14 ounces, so about a half a can for all the pizzas that I'll make. A clove of garlic, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of red wine vinegar, which is absolutely key in all of this, and some olive oil. They also use dried oregano, but I don't. And then you combine them all in a blender. Now this sauce is there really to add some nice flavor notes to our pizza, right? So we've got lots of flavor from the tomatoes, lots of flavor from the garlic, lots of flavor from the red wine vinegar. And the olive oil does a really good job of helping to emulsify all of those flavors in the sauce, and it's a carrier for a lot of those flavors as well. Okay, so the other component that we've got in our recipe is the cheeses that we use. I'm using 2 kinds of cheeses here. One, I'm using fresh mozzarella, the kind that you get from you get it in a little ball at the grocery store, and I just shred that up. Just kind of tear it to pieces. I like to use this better than the shredded mozzarella. The other thing that we're going to use is some Parmesan cheese. The Parmesan is really nice to use well. It adds a lot of salt and savory flavors to the top of your pizza, and it goes really well. Okay. All right, so now that I've got all my ingredients together, it's time to make our pizza. So I'm going to start by taking my individual pieces here, right? So I've separated out my dough into individual pieces and let it rise for 3 hours on their own. Okay, so here's one dough ball that I'm using, right? And I want to cover it in flour and just let it set. I'm going to let it set and rest after my initial spreading, right? So I'm going to let it rest and ease up. Okay, so I just get it flattened out, and then I'm going to come back to it. All right, wait a couple minutes, come on back, and now I can start working my dough a little bit. So I'm going to get some flour on my hands, and I'm going to start to spread it out. And again, I'm just going to do a little bit of work here, spreading it out, making sure it has a nice smooth surface. And I'm going to come back one more time and do one more round of spreading that I'm not going to show here. Okay, so my dough is ready, and now I'm going to start putting my pizza together. So here comes my sauce, just a little bit. I don't add a lot of sauce to this. All right, so a little bit of sauce goes on. Next, I add a little bit of cheese, start spreading that cheese around. Not too much here. Really, if you add too much cheese on this is plenty of cheese for how it'll melt and all of that. If you add too much, the dough gets a little too damp and doesn't cook up as nicely, and so that's about the amount of sauce I use and cheese I use for my pizza. All right, and then this pizza that I have we're going to put pepperoni on it. I made a couple different kinds of pizza as I was doing this. We're going to show the pepperoni here, but I also made olive. One of my daughters loves olive pizza, so I made olive. I made a broccoli pizza. a couple of pepperoni pizzas, and some cheese pizza. All right, so and then I'm gonna finish this all off by adding some Parmesan on top. All right, so now we're gonna get into baking, and there's a couple things to think about while you're baking. One of the big things that I try to do is I try to bake my pizza as quickly on the bottom as I do on the top, right? So you want to bake both the top and bottom at the same time, and that's tricky to do at home in our conventional ovens. I have a couple of tricks that I use. One of the things that I love to use, and one piece of a tool that I have in my kitchen that I love, that I highly recommend for anyone who wants to make a pizza, is a pizza steel. So a lot of you have, or a baking steel. A lot of you have baking stones at home, the little ceramic things that you might cook pizzas on, or nachos or something like that. I have a baking steel at home, and the steel is great because it soaks up so much energy when you preheat your oven with the steel in it. So when I get my oven ready for baking, baking pizza, what I do is I take my top rack in my oven and move it as high as I can get it, close to the broiler. Then I put the pizza steel on it, or the baking steel on it, and I preheat my oven as high as it will go. My oven goes to 550 degrees Fahrenheit, but I heat it up as high as possible, as hot as possible. And I let that steel soak up tons of energy. And what that does is when you put your uncooked pizza onto the steel, there is a really, really fast transfer of energy to cook your pizza, right? There's loads of energy transfer, really fast energy transfer, real fast. All right. The other thing that I do is right before I bake my pizza, I turn the oven off and I turn the broiler on. That way I am cooking the pizza from the top and the bottom at the same time. If I don't do that, my cooking isn't what I want it to be. So it's nice to get that cooking from both directions as you're baking your pizza. And so a couple of things are going on here, right? We are going to cook our dough, which involves setting some gluten. It involves hydrating our starches, and it involves the Maillard reaction, that browning that you see, sort of those leopard spottings that you see on the top of the dough there. In this picture, you're going to heat your sauce and you're going to melt your cheeses. And with this pepperoni pizza, I'm also going to crisp up the pepperoni. Okay, so here's the final product. It turned out really well. We really enjoyed eating our pizza last night. But again, cooking from the top and the bottom at the same time is really important. That way you get sort of your browned pepperoni. You get that leopard spotting that you see on the top of the pizza. You get a nice oven rise from the dough expanding as you cook it. All right, and you can see some of that spotting on the bottom. Here's the bottom of the pizza that I was eating. Again, it turned out really nicely. Okay, so go home, make your own pizzas, have some fun with it. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, anything else, feel free to write me. I hope everyone is doing well.